A world-renowned chef is found lifeless in his own smoker, a rare orchid in his throat, and a familiar knife by his side. When suspicion threatens the very heart of Nero Wolfe's household, only the great detective's intellect can cut through the deception. Welcome, dear listener. Where are you joining us from today? And what time is it for you? Early morning or late at night? Whatever the hour, make yourself comfortable, pour something warm, and prepare your mind as we step into a mystery where every ingredient matters and justice, like a fine sauce, is best served with precision. Thursday mornings at the Brownstone have a rhythm all their own. By 9, I've had my coffee, checked the mail, circled the news items that might interest Wolfe, a short list, and reviewed my evening's calendar, a shorter one. Normally, that's when I hear Fritz's soft footsteps pass my office door on the way to serve Wolfe his beer. But this time, they didn't pass. They stopped. Hard. The door to the orchid room creaked open without ceremony, an act that would normally provoke a glacial glare from the master of the orchids. But Wolfe didn't even raise his head. Neither did I. That is, until Fritz's voice cracked in the doorway. "Mr. Wolfe, please, I beg your pardon, but I must speak at once." Wolfe, kneeling over a Peristeria lata, delicately adjusting a misting valve, gave a growl barely louder than the orchid's bloom. "Fritz, I'm among my cattleyas." "Yes, sir," Fritz replied, his voice a full octave above its usual register. "But I've received a call. It's Carlo Benetti. He's gone missing." That did it. Wolfe straightened, not quickly, mind you. His rate of motion always fell somewhere between regal and glacial. But he turned, his eyebrows heavy and furrowed, moved upward just enough to count as interest. "The chef?" "Yes," Fritz said, "my oldest friend in New York. We worked together at Lambert's before I came here. He called me last week, said he feared someone meant to steal from him. Recipes. He said someone close had betrayed him." I glanced at Wolfe. Nothing. The man could freeze lava with a look. "I told him to come speak with you. He didn't. Then yesterday I received this." Fritz extended an envelope, its contents trembling in his hand. "Not from age, from fear?" Wolfe grunted. "Mr. Goodwin, if you please." I rose, took the envelope, and gave Fritz a glance meant to calm, though I doubted it worked. His pale face was the picture of guilt, grief, and something close to dread. Whatever was inside this letter, it wasn't just paprika and gossip. The paper was thick, the kind you use when you want something to be remembered. The handwriting was neat, but hurried, European script with long-tailed letters and tight curves. "Fritz," I read aloud, "I fear it's come to a head. Someone knows about La Rosa Rossa. They've tried once already to get it, from my drawer no less. I suspect they've copied the base from one of my menus. I don't know whom to trust anymore. The tasting is tomorrow, and if I go public, it may be the last thing I do." I paused. Wolfe said nothing, his eyes half-lidded behind a blooming Kelegin. "Fritz," the letter continued, "if anything happens, I've placed the master copy where no chef would think to look. Please believe me when I say this is not paranoia. The knives are out. Yours, in haste, Carlo." "La Rosa Rossa," I said, lowering the page. "Is that a pasta, a sauce, or a code?" Fritz shook his head. "It's a master reduction, Carlo's great achievement. He spent a decade refining it. There are whispers he planned to sell it as the basis for a line of sauces, but only once perfected. It was precious to him." Wolfe spoke now, slowly. "Foolish." "Sir," Fritz said, "to waste 10 years of one's life boiling wine and vinegar over a stove is foolish. But theft, treachery—" He adjusted the leaf of an orchid. "That is intolerable." I expected Wolfe to wave Fritz off and retreat into his orchid mist like some jungle deity. But something in his tone shifted, barely, but enough that I knew the wheels were turning. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "the man is missing, the sauce may be stolen, and Fritz is beside himself. That trifecta is sufficient, even if culinary crimes are beneath the dignity of this establishment." I take it we're not sending him to missing persons? I take it you'll find this Carlo Bonetti, Wolfe said, or the cause of his absence. If it's merely jealousy among kitchen knaves, we shall send Fritz a condolence bouquet and return to more cerebral pursuits. If not, I said, we find who stuck a fork in his reduction. Fritz gave a soft gasp, somewhere between shock and gratitude. Wolfe ignored it. Begin with the chef's last known engagements. Find the nature of this tasting. See if the sauce is the only thing that's gone missing, and do not under any circumstances sample the food. I'll resist the temptation, I said, tucking the letter into my coat. But for the record, if someone's stealing recipes and stabbing chefs, I may need hazard pay. You already receive it, Wolfe said. You merely disguise it as my gratitude. And with that, he turned back to his orchids, as if betrayal, secrets, and stolen sauces were no more disruptive than a drop in humidity. The gala was held at the Verdanza Hotel, a place that believes chandeliers and foie gras make up for drafty ceilings and sluggish staff. I arrived under the pretense of covering the event for a fictional gastronomic traditions column, credentials courtesy of Lon Cohen. The room smelled like ambition and truffle oil, and every man in white was sharpening either a knife or a grudge. Carlo Bonetti's absence was noted, but no one dared say the word missing. In a room of culinary royalty, admitting concern for a fallen colleague is like complimenting someone else's soufflé. You just don't do it. I was halfway through a mocktail and a microscopic mushroom tart when someone tapped my elbow. "You're not food press," the voice said. "Your shoes are shined and your tie's real." I turned. The speaker was thin, pale, and draped in an apron that probably cost more than my suit. "Neither are you," I replied, "but I like your deduction. I'm sous chef Laurent, and you're asking about Carlo." "I might be." He was going to announce something tonight, an exposé. He didn't tell me what, only that it would change how we cook. Sounded more like vengeance than innovation. And now he's not here, and Antonia is. The name dropped like a butcher's cleaver. I followed his gaze across the ballroom, where a woman in a sea-glass dress held court with an unsettling grace. Antonia Lafarge, the rising star of modern French cuisine. Carlo's former protégé and, by reputation, the only chef who could match his palate and possibly his motives. I made a mental note and moved to mingle. A few paces in, I was intercepted by Gideon Wells, owner of the glitzy bistro Brûlé Noir. He greeted me like we were old friends, which is always a red flag. "If you're here about Carlo," he whispered, "you'll find yourself swimming upstream. The man made enemies faster than reductions." "He was a chef," I said. "You all make enemies by breakfast." "Yes, but Carlo, he accused people. He didn't hint. He named. I once got a cease and desist because he said my duck à l'orange was a theft." "Was it?" "It was better," he said with a grin, which to Carlo was worse. By the end of the evening, I had a pocket full of names and a headache full of contradictions. Carlo had last been seen 2 nights ago at a private tasting event hosted by the Culinary Society. He'd brought a sealed folder rumoured to contain a master recipe and left alone, looking grim. No one saw him after. Well, almost no one. Antonia Lafarge was surrounded by cameras and compliments, but I managed to slip in by waving my fake press badge and looking as blandly admiring as I could manage. "You knew Carlo well," I said, once I had her ear. She tilted her head. "Yes, he taught me to slice, to season, and to survive. He also taught me never to trust a man who compliments your plating before tasting your food." "A philosopher." "A paranoid," she replied, "but a brilliant one." "Where were you 2 nights ago? The private tasting?" She didn't blink. "I was in Long Island, consulting for a client. I have the receipts, the emails, and, if necessary, a rather annoyed chauffeur to prove it." I nodded. "You seem prepared." "I'm female and successful. I stay prepared." There was something in her tone, call it too polished, the kind of polish that suggests someone practiced their innocence in a mirror. She spoke of Carlo in the past tense, which might have been a slip or a signal. Either way, it was enough to warrant further digging. As I turned to leave, she added, "If Carlo's in trouble, it's not from me. He made a habit of discovering secrets people paid good money to bury. Maybe this time he unearthed one too many." I thanked her and made for the coat check. Back in the cab, heading toward the brownstone, I pulled out my notes. Names, motives, and a shadow that was growing over this whole affair like a kitchen fire no one wanted to admit had started. Whatever Carlo had planned, it had stirred up more than culinary envy. And if Antonia's alibi held, I'd have to stir deeper. You can always smell a critic before you see one. Not because of cologne, Paul Driscoll wore enough of that to embalm a goat, but because the air around him bristled with fear and flattery. He was seated in the corner of a posh French cafe not far from the gala, tucked behind a napkin and a Negroni, with the studied boredom of someone used to being stared at. "Mind if I interrupt the war on alcohol?" I asked. He glanced up, grimaced, and sighed. "If you must, but know this, I don't talk to hacks." "Then lucky for both of us, I'm not one." "Then who the hell are you?" "I'm looking into a friend of mine, Carlo Bonetti." He tapped a finger on his glass. "Uh-huh. Has he finally poisoned someone?" "Gone missing, actually." Driscoll raised one brow. "More dramatic than his sources, but no, I haven't seen him since the society tasting. He was in rare form that night, paranoid, raving about intellectual theft. Which would make you a suspect, wouldn't it, given your history?" He smiled thinly. "I never stole from Carlo. I eviscerated him in print. Big difference." "But you were there that night." "Of course I was. I never miss a meltdown, and he was about to have one." "What meltdown?" He told me, right at the bar, that someone had copied La Rosa Rossa and planned to unveil it before he could, claimed he'd cornered them, said he had proof, and then he downed a glass of sherry like it was holy water and stormed off. "Did he say who?" "No," Driscoll said, "but I got the sense he was terrified, not furious, terrified. You know the difference?" I nodded. "I see it in Wolfe's eyes when Fritz tries to make veal with lemon." Driscoll chuckled despite himself. "Well, if he's really missing, then someone probably thought he knew too much. And trust me, in our circles, that's enough to make someone disappear." He drained his Negroni, pulled a folded card from his coat pocket, and slid it to me. "Found this in the trash behind the tasting bar. Thought it might amuse me, but it might amuse you more." It was a business card, Carlo's. On the back, in neat pencil, "He stole it, but I'll get it back." The kitchen staff at La Flamme had all the warmth of a tax audit and twice the defensiveness. I'd managed to get a 10-minute sit-down with a recently fired sous chef named Gregor Huntley, who looked like he'd rather be sautéing his own hand than talking to me. "I told them," he muttered. "I told them Carlo's ideas were getting passed around like salt shakers." "You told who?" "The head chef, Antonia. She said it was coincidence. Same prep technique, same plating, same ingredients. Coincidence." "You think she stole from him?" "I think someone did. I think Carlo found out and he was going to call them out. And now? Now he's vanished, and no one's surprised." There was a pause, then a whisper. Literally. 2 line cooks brushing past in the corridor, voices low, too low. "Said he hid it somewhere nobody'd look. Maybe in that damn garden of his." The words drifted back like smoke. I filed them away. Back in the alley, I lit a cigarette for camouflage. 2 more kitchen hands were whispering over their break. "Wells was there, you know," one said. "At the tasting, right before Carlo flipped." "Then maybe he knows who took it." It was hardly testimony, but it had the flavor of truth, bitter, raw, and hard to chew. Gideon Wells didn't like me the first time we met, and the second didn't improve things. He met me in the back of Brûlé Noir, napkin tucked in his collar like a man ready for a fight he wanted to eat. "Still digging through sources and secrets?" he asked. "I like a mystery with flavor," I replied. "Especially when it's been overcooked." He sneered. If you came for drama, talk to Antonia, or that snake Driscoll. I came for facts, like why Carlo was planning to sue you. That was an overblown threat. He thought I'd lifted one of his base reductions. It's nonsense. There are only so many ways to roast garlic and reduce stock. Then why the cease and desist? Publicity stunt. Carlo was slipping. He needed attention. But you were there the night of the tasting. I was, and I left early. Carlo was being theatrical. He told someone they'd stolen from him. If he did, he said it to everyone. That was his style. He'd rather light a match in a pantry than settle anything quietly. Still, I said, I hear he had proof. Wells stood, smoothed his jacket, and gave me a look that was all starch and stone. Then let the proof speak, but unless you have a subpoena or a spatula, I'm done talking. I left the bistro with the faint scent of char, and something else, fear. Everyone I'd spoken to had a reason to want Carlo quiet. The only question now was, who wanted it enough? The call came just after noon. Saul Panzer's voice was steady as always, which made the words more jarring. Carlo Bonetti's been found. You'll want to see this. The address he gave led me to a modest apartment above a culinary bookstore in Midtown, the kind of place where the rent is paid in passion and paprika. A patrolman nodded me through with the resigned look of someone who knew they weren't going to understand anything that happened next. Inside it smelled of cedar, garlic, and the sharp metallic tang that always signals something has gone deeply wrong. Carlo's kitchen was pristine until you reached the back corner. That's where they'd installed the industrial smoker, a custom model sealed tight and designed to slow cook without escape. It hadn't been used since the night of the tasting, or rather, not until someone decided to use it as a coffin. Inside lay Carlo. He was curled unnaturally, knees bent, as if trying to escape the inevitable. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no violence, just the unnerving calm of someone who'd trusted the wrong person and paid for it with silence. But it was what lay beside the body that froze me. 2 knives crossed deliberately on a wooden cutting board. One bore the insignia of La Flamme. The other was unmistakable. A 10-inch carbon steel blade, French-forged with a handle worn from decades of one man's grip. Fritz's knife. I stood there longer than I meant to. A uniform coughed behind me, as if to remind me I was still part of the living. I called Wolfe from the nearest landline, though I suspected he already knew what I'd say. "Report," he said. "He's gone, in his smoker. No marks, no wounds." "And?" "They left something for you," I said. 2 knives. One of them's Fritz's." There was a pause, a long one. "I see," he said. I didn't ask if he'd be joining the investigation in person. We both knew better. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Fritz was in the kitchen polishing silver that didn't need polishing and muttering to himself in German. "Sit down," I said, "before you polish a hole through the tray." He didn't look at me. Was it my knife?" "Yes." His hands stilled. "They took it from here?" "That's the working theory. The killer wants it to look like either you did it or that someone in this house was involved." "I would never." "I know," I said, "and so does Wolfe. But the fact remains, someone has gone to a lot of trouble to drag your name into this, and by extension Wolfe's." He nodded once, stiffly. "That knife has not left this kitchen in years." "Well, someone left with it, and unless you've got a kleptomaniac delivery boy, we're going to need to figure out how they got it." I gave Wolfe the full rundown that evening in the office, while he sipped beer like it contained clues. When I got to the knife, he closed his eyes for a moment and let out a breath that might have been mistaken for a growl. "This is not mere provocation," he said. "It is insult. Whoever did this wants more than misdirection. They want me to engage." "And will you?" "Of course," he said. "They've offered a challenge. I accept." The next surprise came not from a suspect, but from a lab technician who owed Saul Panzer a favor. A sealed envelope arrived that afternoon. Wolfe opened it with a blade of irony. Inside was a single report, traces of Angricum Seesquipedale, the Darwin's orchid had been found in Carlo's throat, not ingested, not sprinkled, placed. The lab tech noted it was an extremely rare botanical specimen, not known in culinary use. Which made perfect sense, because it wasn't grown anywhere in New York except Wolfe's own rooftop greenhouse. I watched Wolfe as he read the line, his eyes narrowed by degrees like curtains closing on a bad act. "This is deliberate," he said. "Whoever murdered Carlo not only took Fritz's knife, they took my flower." "To what end?" "To signal me," he said. "This was not an attempt to fool the police. This was a private message, an intellectual insult delivered with precision they have taken from my kitchen and my garden." "Whoever it is," I said, "knows you well enough to know what would get your attention." "And they have it," he said grimly. "Now we shall have theirs." He leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together. "Mr. Goodwin, you may tell Saul Panzer to proceed." And just like that the game had changed. Carlo's coat had already been catalogued, bagged and tagged by the time I made my way back to the station. I had to flash credentials I didn't have and leverage favors I couldn't repay, but eventually I got a look. Most of the contents were what you'd expect from a chef who treated fabric like a battlefield: folded recipe cards, 2 matchbooks, and a corkscrew that had probably seen more bottles than a sommelier in midlife crisis. And then there was the card. It was cream-colored, engraved in deep blue ink, and unmistakably formal. At the top, Nero Wolfe, West 35th Street. Below, in Carlo's slanted hand, the words, "Dinner Tuesday. Must talk. Confidential." The envelope it came in bore no return address, but the printing matched Fritz's distinctive looping style, evidence that the invitation had originated from our kitchen, which, as Wolfe later confirmed, it had not. The card was old, one of the spare invitations Fritz kept in a drawer for when Wolfe required dinner guests to observe some semblance of occasion. They were never sent casually. They were never sent without Wolfe's express instruction, and this one had ended up in the coat of a dead man. Back at the brownstone, I laid the card on Wolfe's desk like it was radioactive. "Found in Carlo's inside pocket," I said. Wolfe eyed it, but didn't touch it. "Forgery?" "No," I said. "It's real. One of ours, just not recently." "Then it was planted?" "Looks that way." Wolfe closed his eyes. "The herb, the knife. Now this. Someone is not merely casting suspicion, they are staging a narrative, implying Carlo came here that night, or worse, that you lured him. Yes, to entrap me, to tether me to the murder not as an investigator, but as a host. And if the cops buy it?" "They won't," Wolfe said, "because they're not the audience for this. I am." It didn't take much to get Saul Panzer moving. The man could track a whisper through a wind tunnel. When I briefed him on the stolen recipe journal, rumoured to hold Carlo's culinary innovations in cryptic shorthand, he raised one brow and said, "Gimme 36 hours." He took the invitation with him for good measure. Wolfe, meanwhile, paced. Now, for Wolfe, pacing meant he left the chair 3 times in one afternoon, which in his world ranked just short of a state emergency. He directed me to call the Culinary Society to request a guest list from the night of the tasting. He dictated a letter to the Department of Health, requesting inspection records from every kitchen Carlo had worked in over the last 6 months. And he instructed Fritz to lock the knife drawer with a key he personally took from the butler's pantry and placed in the desk. "Carlo's journal," Wolfe said that evening, "is not a record of taste. It is a record of theft. Whoever took it did not do so for sentimental reasons. They feared what it proved. Which is? That one among his circle had committed a cardinal sin, plagiarism, and that Carlo intended to expose it. Then the killer silenced him. Yes, but not permanently, Wolfe said, because murder leaves loose threads, and Carlo, though dramatic, was never careless. True to prediction, Saul returned just past noon the following day, with the air of a man who'd run through fog and come out with a map. He had a storage locker, Saul said. Brooklyn. Under the name Rosso C, the manager said it smelled like wine and vinegar inside. took a bit of cash to see what was left. "And?" Wolfe asked. Saul pulled a thin, oil-stained notebook from his coat and placed it carefully on the desk. It was wrapped in butcher's paper. Wolfe didn't open the notebook immediately. Instead, he spent the rest of the day in silence, seated beneath his globe lamp like a judge presiding over a court that hadn't yet begun. I offered tea. He declined. I made a joke. It fell like a souffle in a freezer. At 6, Fritz brought dinner. Wolfe picked at it. That's when I knew the killer had gotten to him, not with guilt, not even with malice, but with intellect. This wasn't just a murder, it was a gauntlet, a crime dressed in symbolism and aimed squarely at Wolfe's pride. "They took the knife to point at Fritz," he said finally. "They took the herb to point at me. They left the card to point at this house." "And the journal?" "Is their mistake," Wolfe said. "Because it's not the theft that convicts, it's the record of it. And Carlo, bless his romantic soul, kept everything." He folded his hands and stared at the paper-wrapped journal as though it were a chessboard with one piece left to move. "And now," he said, voice low and clear, "we must draw them in, so I may end this with a single question." "What question?" He looked up. "Who knew enough to hurt us both and still believed they'd get away with it?" Tuesday afternoon at the Brownstone began as most crises do, with impeccable place settings and a simmering sauce. Fritz, for all his unease, produced a luncheon spread worthy of a royal inquisition, which in many ways it was. Wolfe had instructed me to extend personal invitations under the guise of a private culinary consultation, a phrase vague enough to entice the egotistical and frighten the guilty. 4 accepted: Antonia Lafarge, Paul Driscoll, Gideon Wells, and, for comic relief, the sous chef, Gregor Huntley. The drawing-room was arranged with surgical precision. No one sat unless Wolfe allowed it. No one spoke without his silent permission. And I stood near the door like a well-dressed gargoyle, watching everyone breathe too loudly. Wolfe began slowly, as he always did. "Mr. Goodwin has gathered you not in pursuit of gossip, but of clarity. A man is dead, a journal has been found, a chef is accused by implication. I trust we all find such implications intolerable." Driscoll cleared his throat. "You invited us here for clarity, but so far you've offered rhetoric." Wolfe allowed one corner of his mouth to rise. "Rhetoric is the seasoning of clarity, Mr. Driscoll. You should know that. You trade in epigrams." Antonia Lafarge glanced at me and smiled, thin and practiced. Gideon Wells, across from her, stared at the Persian rug like it owed him money. And Gregor Huntley fidgeted so much he nearly knocked over his glass twice. The temperature in the room wasn't hot, but you could taste the tension, like underdone duck. "Let us be frank," Wolfe said, folding his hands. "Someone in this room knew that Carlo Bonetti was preparing to expose a theft, and someone here had reason to ensure he would never do so." There was a moment of stillness, then a carefully orchestrated wave of denial. Antonia sipped her water. Driscoll looked skyward. Wells muttered about defamation, and Huntley scratched his neck and stared at his knees. No confessions, but a room full of silence that said too much. That's when Wolfe turned his eyes to Antonia. "Miss Lafarge," Wolfe said, "you claimed in a previous conversation with Mr. Goodwin that on the night in question you were in Long Island consulting for a private client. You also said, I believe, that your chauffeur could verify this." Antonia nodded smoothly. "Correct." Wolfe looked toward me. I opened the folder I'd been saving and handed him a printed page. "Unfortunately," I said, "the private client, one Mrs. Noreen Fuchs, has been in Provence since the beginning of the month. She returned only yesterday and, according to her assistant, has not hosted guests at her estate for weeks." Antonia blinked. "That must be a mistake. Perhaps the schedule—" "Perhaps," Wolfe cut in, "but unlikely." Mrs. Fuchs's assistant was quite adamant. She said no one, and I quote, "no one touched the demonstration kitchen while Madame was away." Antonia set down her glass with a touch too much grace. "Then the chauffeur—" "He's gone," I said. "Terminated 2 weeks ago. Your current car service said you had no reservation under your name or any alias they could find on the date in question. She inhaled through her nose. I was there, she said carefully. The arrangements may not have been formalized, but I was consulting. I often visit estates on short notice. Wolfe said nothing. He simply stared. Antonia held his gaze as long as she could, then looked away, her fingers curling slightly on the linen napkin in her lap. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a shift. And Wolfe didn't miss shifts. He catalogued them like vintage wine: colour, bouquet, finish. After a beat, he turned back to the group. We will return to Miss Lafarge in due course, but first, Mr. Driscoll. Driscoll straightened. I won't be accused of murder because I didn't like a man's risotto. You won't be accused, Wolfe said softly, but you will be questioned because you received a note. And we know what it said. Driscoll's eyes flicked to the invitation card Wolfe had placed beside him on the table. He didn't touch it. You've been keeping a souvenir, Mr. Driscoll, I said. A handwritten note from Carlo Bonetti. We found a second, nearly identical copy in his apartment. The original is folded in your wallet. You tucked it behind an outdated health inspection card, probably assuming no one would ask. Driscoll's face flushed, not red, but something closer to sour pink. I kept it because it was bizarre, that's all. Bizarre, Wolfe echoed. Then allow us to examine the contents. Driscoll shifted in his seat, but made no motion toward his wallet. Shall I fetch it? I asked. No need. He withdrew the note with a flourish that might have passed for bravado if his hands weren't trembling. He unfolded it slowly. Wolfe didn't move. Read it. Driscoll cleared his throat. Paul, by the time you read this, I may already have spoken, but if not, know this. I know who took it, and I have proof. Your role is smaller than theirs, but not innocent. I won't go public without warning you first. You deserve that, at least. See, no one spoke. Even Huntley seemed to grasp that this was a turning point. Wolfe's voice, when it came, was low and level. And what did you understand that note to mean? I didn't, Driscoll said. That's why I kept it. It was cryptic. Indeed, Wolfe said. Cryptic, but also damning. Carlo accuses you not of theft, but of complicity, an accessory to someone else's betrayal. I didn't betray him. You only what? I asked. Driscoll's lips compressed. I knew what was going on. I didn't stop it. Why not? He looked at Antonia, then quickly away. That, Wolfe said, is precisely the question. The air felt tighter, like the walls had shifted in closer, and Wolfe, now fully upright in his chair, leaned forward just slightly, a gesture I'd seen only twice before. It meant he smelled the truth. There are few men I trust to root through someone's garbage and come back with gold, but Saul Panzer is one of them. He returned to the brownstone the following morning, faintly winded, faintly grim, and carrying a brown paper bag with the reverence of a priest holding sacrament. I've got it, he said. Behind Brûlé Noir, in the back alley, fourth bin from the left, found it wedged between last week's wine invoices and a half-used tub of duck fat. The journal? I asked. He nodded, handing it to Wolfe, who accepted it with a small, almost imperceptible motion of satisfaction. Wolfe opened the bag, removed the stained leather-bound volume, and flipped it open to the third page. There, in Carlo's compact, disciplined hand, was a line of ingredients annotated with notations, substitution ratios, and dates of experimentation. Every entry followed a code, but one Wolfe had already broken. This, Wolfe said, is the true motive. The source, the accusations, the drama, window dressing. This journal is a ledger of ideas, and someone in this city feared what it could prove. Saul nodded. I dusted it. There are 3 sets of prints. One is Carlo's. One is a match to a former employee, Benji Morales, long since fired. The third... He paused, letting it land. Gideon Wells. Wolfe didn't blink. He lied then, about his proximity to Carlo, about the tasting, about everything. Of course it was Wells. But Saul wasn't finished. It gets better. I traced a purchase. Wells bought a case of carbon steel kitchen knives 2 months ago. The same brand Fritz uses. He gave them as gifts to staff, apparently, except there's no record of one going to Carlo. Because he kept it, Wolfe said, and used it to frame us. I looked at Saul. You're sure the book was tossed recently? Without question, Saul said. The duck fat on the bag expired 3 days ago. That was enough for Wolfe. He placed the journal on his desk, folded his hands, and looked around the office as if seeing it not as a sanctuary, but a stage. We have proof of motive, deception, and manipulation, he said. All we need now is the final performance. And with that, he instructed Fritz to prepare for guests. By mid-afternoon, the forensic report had arrived. I handed it to Wolfe over his chilled beer and watched his brow furrow. That was all. Now, I've learned over the years that a Wolfe has a sliding scale of significance. This one registered somewhere between your evidence is trivial and the solution is beneath me, but I'll indulge. The fingerprint found on Fritz's knife was pristine. Too pristine. No smudges, no cross-contamination, no culinary residue, just a perfect imprint, center-placed on the blade, as if someone had applied it with tweezers and a guilty conscience. It's a plant, I said. The print was staged. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. And not merely to incriminate, to draw focus. From what? From the absence of a real clue. Real evidence is imperfect. Human. This is too clean. I nodded. So who would know how to fake a print and make it look like a mistake worth chasing? Someone precise, Wolfe said. Someone who has studied deception not as an art, but as a science. Antonia is theatrical. Driscoll is self-serving. But Gideon is meticulous. We agreed the knife had never left the brownstone under Fritz's hand. But someone else had taken it, lifted it perhaps during a casual visit, an unmonitored moment in the kitchen, and saved it, deliberately, for the murder. Now it had resurfaced as part of an elaborate performance. Framing Fritz hadn't been the point. Tainting the investigation had. Wolfe leaned forward and tapped the rim of his glass. It is rare, he said, to encounter a mind this methodical, this ego-driven. He believed I would recognize the pattern, and I have, but he also believed I would not dare to answer it. I grinned. Then let's disappoint him. Wolfe grunted. Have Fritz begin preparations and tell Saul to stay nearby. By the time the suspects arrived for round 2 of what they thought was a tasting consultation, or a polite grilling, the office was already set. Wolfe had done something rare that morning. He'd worn a fresh boutonniere. That meant war. Fritz, under careful instruction, served coffee instead of wine and petit fours instead of main courses, a deviation that unsettled everyone just enough to make them polite, but off balance. Antonia arrived first, cool as a cucumber canapé. Gideon came last, his breath minty and his collar crisp, like a man who wanted to appear more composed than he was. They made conversation, or tried to, but Wolfe didn't answer pleasantries. He sat behind his desk, heavy as thunderclouds, watching, listening. He said nothing for 20 minutes, an eternity in social time. Then finally he spoke. The game is complete. Antonia raised an eyebrow. Game? This performance, this charade, the knife, the card, the herb, the journal in the trash, all of it staged to provoke my mind. You assumed that I would relish the challenge, and I do, but only because I know how it ends. No one dared speak. He looked from face to face, his gaze resting a beat longer on Gideon Wells. You made a mistake, Wolfe said, one of scale. You believed you could manipulate perception. You forgot I don't work from perception, I work from fact. And now Mr. Goodwin will show you just how factual it's become. I rose, the folder in hand. And that, Wolfe said, will begin the end. The invitations went out under Fritz's name, embossed in gold, and sealed with the kind of quiet authority that made people cancel flights. It was billed as a memorial tasting dinner in honor of the late chef Carlo Bonetti, an elegant affair to reflect on his legacy and creations. Wolfe insisted on formality, structure, and above all, timing. Every guest arrived within 7 minutes of one another, as if they'd all read the same invisible script. Antonia Lafarge wore a midnight black dress that looked like it had been starched in ambition. Paul Driscoll, despite having lost most of his professional composure the last time we met, showed up polished and wary, eyes flicking about like a man expecting crossfire. Gideon Wells arrived last, exuding confidence like cologne, overpowering and likely to leave stains. And of course, Gregor Huntley, our jittery sous chef, hovered like a man invited to the gallows by mistake. They were ushered into the dining room, one of Fritz's polished sanctuaries. The table gleamed with silver, crystal, and restraint. No labels, no menus. Just 7 chairs and a dinner built to disguise a duel. Wolfe entered last, dressed as he always was for battle, grey silk shirt, black vest, no tie. He nodded to no one. He sat. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice neither warm nor cold. "Tonight, we honor the genius of Carlo Bonetti. You are here not only because you knew him, but because he knew you." The silence that followed had texture. I could have spread it on toast. "I will speak in due time," Wolfe added. "For now, we dine." And with that, Fritz emerged from the kitchen bearing the first course, a delicate amuse-bouche of beet foam over chèvre crostini, a favourite of Carlo's, one that required precision and memory. I watched their faces as the meal began. Antonia's brow was too calm. Gideon's eyes drifted toward the silverware with professional scrutiny. Driscoll looked at the wine glass but didn't drink. And Huntley, well, he twitched. The table held more than guests. It held accusation. And Wolfe, behind his stillness, was already closing the trap. The second course came and went without commentary, a broth so clear it might have whispered its ingredients to the bowl. Then a citrus-cured salmon roulade with microgreens and something that made Driscoll cough. Fritz outdid himself, and no one complimented him. The food was perfect. The tension made it taste like arsenic. Wolfe said nothing. Not a toast, not a question. He watched. I knew the look. His eyes were measuring reaction times, calibrating nerves. Antonia reached for her water just a beat too quickly after the third course. Gideon mopped his brow with his napkin and muttered something about the heat, though the thermostat hadn't budged. And Driscoll kept glancing, always left, toward Antonia. "Dessert will be served shortly," Wolfe said at last, breaking the hour-long performance of composed chewing. "It will be the final course, and also the beginning of what matters." The words hung there like steam from a simmering pot. "You've been part of something," he continued, "that was designed not merely to harm a man, but to harm truth. This house, this reputation, this man." He pointed, gently but firmly, toward Fritz, who had stepped forward from the kitchen archway in his formal whites, spine straight. "There will be no more courses," Wolfe said, "only answers." And dessert, which moments later Fritz placed in front of them, a delicate white chocolate mousse dusted with shaved vanilla bean and crowned with a translucent red reduction, La Rosa Rossa. Or at least a version of it. No one touched it. "Go ahead," Wolfe said. "Taste." And the silence that followed wasn't from politeness. It was from fear. Wolfe let the silence stew for exactly 12 seconds, then turned his gaze to Antonia. "You know what this is," he said. She didn't blink. "It's Carlo's sauce." "No," he replied. "It is almost Carlo's sauce, a facsimile, reconstructed from his notes, but not from his hand." "I wouldn't know," she said, cool as crème anglaise. "Then you'll forgive me if I explain." He folded his hands. "This version contains a subtle binding agent, sulfur extract of black shallot. It enhances depth, but it contradicts Carlo's guiding principle. He considered it vulgar. He told Fritz so more than once." Antonia frowned. Yet it was in the version stolen, in the version he found, in the version that led to his death. Driscoll shifted in his seat, his napkin now a crumpled treaty in his hand. Huntley stared down at the mousse like it might accuse him. "And this ingredient," Wolfe continued, "was not known to Carlo. It was not in his original journal. It was in the reconstructed copy, the one we found in Mr. Wells's trash. Now Gideon finally spoke. "You can't prove I made it." "No," Wolfe said, "but I can prove you printed it. We found a dusting of your office's stationery powder on the corner of the recipe. Old-fashioned stuff, makes a fingerprint stick. Your assistant confirmed it's exclusive to your correspondence drawer." Wolfe leaned forward. "You altered Carlo's sauce, claimed it, feared exposure. You used Driscoll's complicity, Antonia's trust, Huntley's access, and Fritz's knife. You composed this crime like a recipe, with layers, steps, seasoning." Gideon didn't deny it. Not yet. He only smiled, dry and slow. "You can't prove who killed him." "No need," Wolfe said, "because what you can't prove is where you were that night. And you can't prove you weren't in the smoker room because you left something far more damning than a fingerprint." He gestured. Fritz stepped forward and placed the herb box on the table. Inside it, one missing blossom of Angraecum sesquipedale, its stem still moist, its petals bruised. The colour drained from Wells's face like wine down a sink. If Gideon Wells had expected Antonia to shield him, he was disabused of that notion the moment she inhaled sharply at the sight of the orchid. Her eyes widened, just a fraction, but Wolfe noticed. He always notices. Wells stiffened. "You can't tie that flower to me." "No," Wolfe said, "but we can tie it to your attempt to manipulate. You introduced it into Carlo's kitchen. You meant it as a signature, but the signature doesn't belong to you, it belongs to her." All eyes turned to Antonia. "I don't know what you mean," she said quickly. Too quickly. "You do," Wolfe replied. Carlo's private recipe journal contained not only measurements but annotations, initialed corrections. The altered versions of the sauce, which include the sulfur extract and a change to base acidity, were marked with an AL. "That's not Carlo, it's you." "I was helping him," Antonia said, her voice steady but losing its warmth. "He asked me to refine certain elements. I made suggestions." "Which he documented as editorial notes," Wolfe said. "And then rejected. But after he discovered your intent to claim credit, after he told you he planned to name you publicly, you conspired." Driscoll, visibly pale now, muttered. "She told me it was just a precaution, that Carlo was paranoid, that she only needed time to get the recipe registered under her name." Antonia turned to him sharply. "You said you'd stay quiet." "I said I'd delay him," Driscoll shot back. "Not bury him." Wolfe raised a hand. "Enough. You manipulated Carlo into sharing drafts, then fed them to Wells, who finessed them, published them in his ghost-written tasting notes, and positioned himself for exclusivity. When Carlo threatened exposure, the alliance shifted from theft to removal." Antonia stood. "I never meant for him to die." "But you created the structure that made it inevitable," Wolfe said. "You handed Wells the ingredients. He chose how to cook the outcome." Gregor Huntley, silent until now, said quietly, "She told me to leave the kitchen unlocked. That's all." Antonia closed her eyes. "I wanted credit," she said finally. "I'd spent years behind men like him, watching them get awards, recognition, power, while I wrote their menus. I thought I could take what I deserved, and when he turned on me, I panicked." "You framed Fritz," I said. "I didn't know Wells would do that," she snapped. "He said it would be clean, quick. He said he'd scare him, not—" She stopped. That was the end of her composure, and the beginning of something Wolfe always preferred: confession. There was no need to raise his voice. Wolfe never did. He remained seated behind his desk, one hand resting gently on the recipe journal, the other on the orchid box, as if balancing two scales of justice. "You misjudged me," he said to the room, though it was Gideon Wells who flinched. "You believed I would be intrigued. I was. But you also believed I would be flattered by the complexity. I was not." Wells opened his mouth to object, perhaps to deny everything, perhaps to redirect blame, but Wolfe continued. "You constructed a riddle, a murder cloaked in culinary theatre, You staged it with flair, knives, herbs, forged invitations, stolen notebooks. You underestimated two things. One, that I keep records. Two, that I keep people. He glanced toward Saul, who stepped forward with a sealed bag. In this are photographs of Wells entering the back of La Flamme on the night of Carlo's death. He used a keycard borrowed from Huntley. He left just before the cleaning crew arrived. A 10-minute window, long enough to stage a smoker scene and insert the orchid. Gideon's lips pressed into a thin line. His confidence was eroding in layers now, flaking like burnt sugar. Furthermore, Wolfe continued, you returned to Brûlé Noir and discarded the recipe journal after Driscoll's sudden nerves made you realize how fragile your position had become. Do you plan to turn this over to the police? Gideon asked, voice brittle. No, Wolfe said. I plan to inform them. What they do next is their concern. Wells gave a mirthless chuckle. You don't want justice? I want the truth to be restored, Wolfe said, glancing at Fritz. And I want it known that in this house knives do not wander, flowers do not disappear, and friends are not made scapegoats. Fritz stood a little straighter at that. I took the journal, sealed it, and handed it to Saul. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Mr. Goodwin will escort you all out now, he said. Dinner is concluded. Justice, however, is being served. When Antonia left the brownstone that evening, it was not in cuffs, nor flanked by uniformed men. Wolfe would never allow that sort of vulgarity in his house. Saul, efficient as ever, had arranged a private call to the authorities, who met her outside in an unmarked sedan. There was no shouting, no crying, just a single, whispered apology, directed at no one in particular, as she stepped into the car and vanished down the block. Wolfe watched from the dining room window, but didn't comment. He rarely did in such moments. Finality, for him, wasn't an event. It was a mood, something you let settle like good wine. Will Wells speak? I asked. No, he said. He'll listen to his attorney. And Driscoll? He will write a reflective piece on betrayal, call it fiction, and sell it to a third-rate quarterly. And Huntley? Wolfe grunted. He will saute shallots somewhere less demanding. That, apparently, concluded the disposition. Justice, Wolfe murmured, does not always shout. It often clears its throat and moves on. Fritz returned to the kitchen after the guests had left, but he didn't cook. He just stood by the counter, his arms folded, his brow furrowed, in a way that made me think of the old-world chefs you only saw in oil portraits. I found him there, pretending to review spice labels that hadn't changed since Roosevelt's first term. She framed me, Archie, he said, not turning. She used my knife. She used your reputation, I replied. The knife was just a shortcut. He nodded slowly. That evening, Wolfe called Fritz into the office. Rare. Wolfe prefers to let respect simmer in silence, but this time he made it audible. Fritz, he said, you have served me for decades. You are a steward of discipline, taste, and discretion. Your honor was not in question, but I'm gratified we proved it to those who doubted. Fritz said nothing, but his eyes, normally clouded with steam and seasoning, brightened. I regret I doubted myself, he said quietly. You had no cause, Wolfe replied, and no stain. We returned to the table, where Fritz poured the final wine, and sat not as servant, but as peer. And for once, Wolfe didn't object. The meal that followed was simple. A veal ragout served with garden vegetables and a saffron risotto that deserved a standing ovation. Wolfe ate heartily, which meant the storm had passed. I, for one, had seconds. It was late, and the city outside the window pulsed with that particular New York quiet, where you can't hear anything, but you know everything's still alive. Do you think she would have stopped? I asked. Wolfe dabbed his mouth. Number, she would have doubled down. Liars refine lies. She could have been great, on her own terms. Perhaps, he said, but she mistook cleverness for worth. An error most people never correct. I leaned back. It's strange, isn't it? All that noise, and in the end it was a source. No, Wolfe said, it was a principle, precision, Discipline, the same virtues in cuisine as in reason, she betrayed them both. He refilled his glass, halfway. An indulgence, by his standards. Archie, we are surrounded by people who seek shortcuts, to fame, to money, to reputation, but shortcuts erase craftsmanship, and once that's gone, what remains? I shrugged. Opinion columns, reality shows? He scowled. We sat for a while, the meal finished, the kitchen quiet. The orchid room light still glowed faintly, silhouetting Wolfe's favourite blooms. The last of the Darwin's orchids had been returned to its place, delicate but intact. "I don't like being baited," Wolfe said at last. "But I admit I enjoy snapping the trap." I raised my glass. "To slow thinking and faster wit." He didn't toast, he just nodded, and that was all the agreement I needed. As Archie filed away the last page of Carlo Bonetti's journal, Wolfe remained in his chair, eyes half closed, not in weariness, but in thought. "It is curious," he murmured, "how the smallest omission, a single bruised herb, can betray an entire performance. In the end, it wasn't passion or panic that gave them away. It was precision turned against itself. But tell me, dear listener, what do you think was the criminal's gravest mistake? Was it the forged recipe, or choosing a mind like Wolfe's as their opponent? We'd love to hear your take. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this tale left you savouring the flavour of justice, don't forget to subscribe for more Nero Wolfe mysteries served fresh. Share this story with friends who enjoy their deduction sharp and their detectives sharper. Until next time, keep your wits about you and your sources original.